You are now listening to Hinckley Community Radio, a non-profit podcast radio station.
It was during the cold spring of 1922 that German farmer Andreas Gruber, his family and their maid were brutally bludgeoned and hacked to death with a rusty pickaxe. Their bodies were then stacked up in the barn at the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse home in Germany. The killer then proceeded to hang out at the farm for the next few days with the 6 dead bodies for company. Yes, you heard that right. 6 dead bodies for company. Despite nearly a century of investigations, employing everything from clairvoyance to the most modern forensic techniques, the killer is still not known. Hinterkaifeck was a small farmstead, situated between the Bavarian towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, approximately 70 kilometres or 43 miles north of Munich. It has become infamous as the scene of one of the most gruesome and puzzling unsolved crimes in German history. Prior to the incident, the family and their previous maid reported hearing strange sounds coming from the attic, which is what led the maid to quit. So, who was making the strange sounds? What were they? And why? The case to this day remains unsolved. Greetings, Unexplained peeps. Thank you for tuning in and listening to Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I am an artist, a drama queen, and a psychic medium who wonders, if a cup is round and the container is round, why do we call it Ovaltine? Tonight, I'm going to tell you the unexplained story about the Hinterkaifeck murders. I will now give you the necessary disclaimer. This story is a tale that sadly involves children and graphic detail, so it may prove upsetting to some. You listen at your own discretion, and although all opinions and comments are strictly my own, the facts still remain. I also apologise if I pronounce Hinterkaifeck or any of the other German words incorrectly, as my English, although it is my first and only language, does need some elocution training at times. So, back to the story. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was built around 1863, and the 6 victims who were living there at the time were Andreas Gruber, aged 63, and his older wife, Gisela Gruber, aged 72, their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, aged 35, and I'll go into more details as to why she was widowed later on, and Victoria's children, Gisela, aged 7, and Joseph, aged 2, and lastly the maid, Maria Baumgartner, aged 44. They were all found struck dead. First, let's look at the events building up to the murders. Six months prior to the attack at Hinterkaifeck, Maria, the family maid, had quit, claiming that the house was haunted because she kept hearing strange sounds coming from the attic and had a constant feeling that she was being watched. If the Gruber's former maid was to be believed, it is possible someone had been living inside the attic at the Hinterkaifeck home for over 6 months. In March 1922, Andreas Gruber found a strange newspaper from Munich on the property. He could not remember ever buying the newspaper, so he initially believed that the postman must have lost the newspaper by accident. But this was not the case, as no one in the vicinity subscribed to the Munich paper, and also one of the family's 2 sets of house keys disappeared. Just days before the murder, Gruber told neighbours that he discovered tracks in the fresh snow that led from the forest to a broken door lock in the farm's machine room. Also, during the night, they all heard footsteps in the attic, but Gruber found no one when he searched the building. Although he told several people about these alleged horror movie clichés observations, he refused to accept help, and he decided to borrow a gun from one of his neighbours to protect himself and his family, so nothing was ever reported to the police. According to a school friend of the 7-year-old Kážila Gabriel, the young girl reported that her mother, Victoria, had fled the farm the night before the killings after a violent quarrel, and only hours later had been found in the forest. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, had arrived on a Friday the 31st of March. Maria's sister had escorted her there and left the farm after a short stay. Her sister was more than likely the last person to see the inhabitants alive. Now, let's look at the murders themselves. Just to warn you, it is a little graphic. It appeared that in the late evening, Victoria Gabriel, her 7-year-old daughter Kážila, and her parents, Andreas and Kážila, was somehow lured to the family barn through the stable, where they were murdered one at a time. The elder Kážila had her skull cracked from multiple blows to the head, actually breaking it open. She also had signs of strangulation. Andreas had blood caked all over his face, which was described as shredded, with his cheekbones sticking out of his ragged flesh. The daughter, Victoria, also had her skull shattered. Her face had collapsed, with signs that she had been hit with a blunt object, in addition to a number of other wounds, including a skull-shattering wound on the top of her head. Perhaps the worst off, however, was Gruber's granddaughter, who had her jaw smashed and her throat cut. It is believed that she began pulling her own hair out while she watched the rest of the family being slaughtered, but more on that later. The perpetrator then stacked the family's bloody corpses on top of each other and covered them over with hay. The murderer then moved into the living quarters of the property where, with the same murder weapon, he killed Joseph sleeping in his bassinet and Baumgartner in her bedchamber, then covered with sheets and a dress. The two of them seem to have died fairly quickly, following a number of blows to their heads and faces. The tools used in the murders was likely a mattock, a pickaxe-like tool which was used for digging. The killings went undetected for 4 days, until the 4th of April 1922. This was largely because in the days after the murders, the Gruber's neighbours saw smoke coming from the home's chimney, indicating someone was using the fireplace. Thus, it seemed as if the family were alive and well. In addition, the farm animals and livestock were fed, and even the cows had been milked. On the 1st of April, coffee sellers Hans and Edward Swarovski arrived at Hinterkaifeck to take an order from the family as normal. When no one responded to the knocks on the door or on the windows, they walked around the yard to see if they were out the back, but still found no one. They only noticed that the gate to the machine house was open before they decided to leave. Despite the Gruber family's reputation for keeping to themselves, people became concerned when Kážila Gabriel was absent from school without any excuse for the next few days, and the family failed to show up for Sunday worship as usual, and there was a considerable amount of mail piling up at the post office for them. Assembler Albert Hoffner went to Hinterkaifeck on April the 4th to repair the engine of the food chopper. He stated that he had not seen any of the family and had heard nothing but the sounds of the farm animals and the dog barking inside the barn. After waiting for an hour, he decided to start work on the repair, which he completed in roughly 4.5 hours. At around 3:30 p.m, Lorenz Schittenbauer sent his son Johann, 16, and his stepson Joseph, 9, to Hinterkaifeck to see if they could make contact with the family. When they reported that they did not see anyone, Schlittenbauer headed to the farm himself the same day with Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigil. Entering the barn, they found the dead bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilla Gruber, his daughter Victoria Gabriel, and his granddaughter Kazilla, all who had been murdered in the barn. Shortly after, while searching, they found the chambermaid, Maria Baumgartner, and the youngest family member, Victoria's son Joseph, murdered in the home. So, now, let's take a look at the investigation, shall we? Inspector George Reingruber and his department investigated the killings. The initial investigations were hampered by the number of people who had interacted with the crime scene, by moving both the bodies and various other objects around at the scene. Some people had even cooked and eaten meals in the kitchen. After the bodies of the Gruber family and their housekeeper were discovered, court physician Johann Baptist Amula performed the autopsies in situ in the barn. It was established that the mattock axe was the most likely weapon used, though the weapon itself could not be found at the scene. A mattock axe is a hand tool used for digging, prying and chopping, similar to a pickaxe, but with a vertical axe blade one side and a horizontal blade the other. Eventually, a year later, investigators found the mattock axe in the attic at the house during the demolition of the building. Then, the court physician removed the heads of all 6 victims, which he reportedly sent to Munich for further examination, where the skulls were then kept. Thus, the bodies of the Gruber family and their maid, Maria Baumgartner, were buried without their heads. Allegedly, the skulls of the Grubers and their maid were also given to clairvoyants, presumably in an effort to learn more about the perpetrator or perpetrators who had committed the brutal massacre. According to the authorities, the skulls went missing following the upheaval caused by World War II and were never recovered afterwards. Evidence showed that the daughter, the young Kazilla, had been alive for several hours after the assault. It appeared she had torn out tufts of her own hair, as clumps of it were in her hands, and bald patches were all over her head as she lay in the straw, terrified and dying, next to the corpses of her mother and grandparents in the barn for several hours. At first, police suspected the motive to be a robbery, and they interrogated travelling craftsmen, vagrants, and several inhabitants from the surrounding villages. However, when a large amount of money had been found in the house, they abandoned this theory. It was clear the perpetrator had remained at the farm for several days, as someone had fed the cattle, eaten the entire supply of bread from the kitchen, and had recently cut meat from the pantry. With no clear motive to be gleaned from the crime scene, the police began to formulate a list of suspects. After a short break, we will look at a few suspects